My wife refused to kiss me when she arrived from the company dinner, so I announced the divorce with the calm of someone who understood everything in the silence of a gesture. I didn't make a scene, I simply left the key to our story on the table and left. And in that instant, between the absence of a kiss and the weight of the silence, something inside me died. It wasn't anger, nor scandal, nor violence. It was simply the dull pain of someone who loved too much and, because of that, realized they had become invisible to those who mattered most. She tried to explain later, with the jumbled words of someone who already knew there was no more room for justification. But it was too late. So late that even time seemed tired of waiting for some honesty. When she found herself free, the lover who seemed promising vanished like smoke. And then, alone, she had to face the emptiness she chose and the regret she avoided. Meanwhile, I began, silently, to rebuild my life. And no, it wasn't easy. When you're betrayed, your heart doesn't bleed all at once. It slowly rots inside, in the corners where the memory still lives, where her scent still lingers on the pillow, where the promises we made still echo without an echo, where the love I gave completely lived with its doors open. I slept through sleepless nights replaying scenes I never asked to remember, rehearsing conversations that would never happen, searching for signs I was too blind to see. The worst part of betrayal isn't the lie, it's realizing that, while you were whole, the other person had already silently left. She left me long before dinner that night, and I only realized it when the absence of the kiss exploded in my face like an irrefutable truth. She tried to talk. She tried to find me in the following days. She sent me long, confusing messages, with rehearsed apologies and attempts to rewrite the story. One text said, "It wasn't quite like that," another, "I lost myself, but I still love you," and the last, in a more blunt tone, said, "I thought he was different, but he wasn't." And that's when I understood, she hadn't betrayed me just with a body, but with a dream. She had projected onto another man what should have been built with me, and that, for me, was unforgivable. Not out of revenge, but out of dignity. Love, when true, demands truth, and she denied me that. I loved her so much that I ended up forgetting myself, and it was in that forgetfulness that she lost herself too. Months passed. And little by little, like someone reborn after an earthquake, I began to recover. The loneliness that had initially been heavy was transformed into peace. I began cooking for myself, tidying the house with only my things, opening the windows without asking for opinions. I started laughing silently again, listening to music without fear of remembering it. One day, without realizing it, I caught myself smiling at someone. It was a shy, unpretentious smile, but full of truth. And then I realized, I was ready. Ready to live again, to love without fear, but with awareness. I met someone. She wasn't a perfect woman, nor was I a fully healed man. But there was truth. And lightness. And respect. With her, love didn't shout, didn't demand, didn't hurt. It just happened. That's when she reappeared. Months later, on a random afternoon, she asked to talk. I accepted. Not out of curiosity, but because within me, only peace remained. She arrived with different eyes, perhaps for the first time without emotional makeup. She said everything she'd never said before. She cried. She asked for forgiveness. She said she'd traded a solid love for a fragile adventure. That she'd been wrong to think passion was more important than construction. That she'd tried to forget me in the arms of someone who never truly loved her. She said that when she saw me leaving without crying out, she understood the weight of what she'd lost. I listened to everything calmly. I didn't interrupt. I didn't judge. Because in that moment, the two of us no longer existed, only what we were and what each of us became later existed. I forgave. Unhurriedly. Without resentment. Not to get back together, but to move on in peace. I told her that forgiveness was necessary so I wouldn't carry hate where there once was love. That she was no longer the woman of my life, but rather an important story that had taught me so much. She looked at me with the tearful eyes of someone who understands, for the first time, what it means to lose a true love. I left that meeting with a light heart. She was left with the memories. I moved on with my life. Months later, something unexpected happened. I was invited to a wedding. Her brother's. I was torn. Going meant facing ghosts, rediscovering the past in full regalia. But something inside me told me I had to go. Not for her, but for myself. To make sure the wound had healed. I arrived with my new partner, hand in hand, with a calmness that surprised me. She was there, whole. And it was at the moment of the toast, when everyone raised their glasses to celebrate love, that I saw her. She was alone. And her eyes were fixed on me. For the first time, I didn't feel pain. She did. In that moment, she understood everything. Because I smiled. Not out of revenge, but out of genuine happiness. And she realized that smile wasn't for her anymore. It was the same smile that had once been hers, but now lived in another gaze. In another life. In another story. Life has a strange way of teaching us the value of things. Sometimes we lose what we love most because we don't know how to take care of it. Sometimes we trade gold for jewelry just because it shines brighter in the dark. But the shine fades. And what remains is absence. The echo of what could have been. The silence of a kiss that never happened. The goodbye of someone who left without a shout. Because they understood, in the silence, that everything had already been said. But what she said to me at the end of that night, that, I will never forget. Never. And that's where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal isn't romanticized, it's exposed. Our stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. Each storyline is a reminder of how one wrong choice can destroy what matters most, true love. Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense narrative, where the price of betrayal is paid with tears, regret, and silence. Now take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear, will scar you. They met on a summer afternoon, the kind that seems to promise more than time can deliver. Gabriel was 27, with a serene spirit, a steady gaze, and a kindness that was no longer common. He was the kind of man who looked you in the eye when he spoke, who listened with genuine attention, and remained silent when he had nothing to add. He came from a simple family, but with strong values, the kind that are learned more by example than by words. He worked as a civil engineer and lived a predictable, almost monotonous routine, until she arrived, as if she didn't ask permission, but changed everything just by being there. Isabella was the opposite of predictable. She was 25 years old, with a striking presence and an energy that filled the room. She laughed easily, but her soul was layered. She worked in advertising at a mid-sized agency, dividing her days between meetings, rushed coffees, and endless brainstorming sessions. Her extroverted demeanor contrasted with Gabriel's calmness, but it was precisely this contrast that brought them together. They met at a dinner party with mutual friends, and that night, the conversation flowed as if they had known each other for a lifetime. It wasn't love at first sight, it was something quieter, more real, it was a connection. The first few months were intense. Spontaneous outings, long late-night conversations, plans hatched between kisses and laughter. They didn't speak of the future as an obligation, but as a desire. Gabriel, with his steady demeanor, offered the security Isabella never knew she needed. And she, with her infectious enthusiasm, brought color back to his gray days. Their differences didn't drive them apart, on the contrary, they built bridges through them. In just over a year, they were living together, and 6 months later, they were married in a simple but meaningful ceremony. Friends and family witnessed not just a union, but a silent promise of complicity. The beginning of their life together was marked by adjustments, like any real life together. There were Gabriel's obsessions with organization, Isabella's impulsive way of changing plans at the last minute, the arguments over what to do on the weekend or the small responsibilities of daily life. But there was also the daily construction of a home, not just a physical space, but a sense of mutual belonging. They laughed easily, made travel plans, discussed names for children even though they weren't in a rush to have them. They created routines that only made sense between them: coffee on the porch on Sundays, a Friday movie with pizza, the notes left around the house. Their intimacy grew in details and revealed itself in the simplest gestures. Isabella, however, gradually began to immerse herself more deeply in her work. She took on new projects, started leaving later, and traveled more frequently for events and meetings. Gabriel, who had always supported her, was proud of the determined woman by his side, but he also noticed the absences accumulating in small gaps. Late-night conversations diminished, dinner together became the exception, and silences began to fill spaces where words once resided. There was still love, but it seemed to require more and more effort to remain visible. Gabriel tried to understand. He was never the type of man to demand presence out of insecurity. He believed in individual space within a relationship, but sometimes he watched Isabella from afar and felt she was there when she wasn't really there. She said she was just tired, that it was a phase, that everything would return to normal. And he believed her. Because love, for him, also meant giving time and respecting the other person's moments. But even in his calm, he began to feel the weight of something invisible. The emotional absences began to be more painful than the physical ones. Isabella was always with her cell phone in her hand, responding to work messages late into the night. Gabriel, previously present in every detail of her life, began to feel like a bystander. He noticed subtle changes: the new perfume she wore but never commented on, the laughter she gave while typing but never shared, the invitations she declined with a weariness that seemed more like an excuse than a truth. Still, he didn't confront her, just observed. Not by omission, but because he believed trust was the foundation of everything. And, at that moment, he preferred to believe it was all just fatigue. She, in turn, was experiencing an internal turmoil she couldn't name. There were days when she felt suffocated by everything, by work, by expectations, by the love that always demanded total surrender. Isabella didn't want to hurt Gabriel, and in truth, she wasn't even sure if something was truly wrong. Sometimes she believed it was just life getting into its routine. Other times, she felt a restlessness she couldn't explain. The few times she tried to open up to him, she ended up retreating mid-sentence, as if unable to put her feelings into words. The home they had built remained standing, but with small cracks in the corners. There were no shouting, no fighting, no heated arguments. There was only silence, and silence between two who once loved each other deeply is perhaps the cruelest form of estrangement. And even with all these cracks, there were gestures that still endured: the coffee left in his favorite cup, the blanket she pulled over him when he slept on the couch, the messages saying, "Get well soon," or "Good luck at the reunion." Small things, but they betrayed that, somewhere, love had not yet died. Their surroundings reflected this moment. The house was organized, but there were piles of forgotten books on the bookshelf, plants beginning to dry out on the porch, and photos no longer updated in the frames. It was as if everything around them were suspended in time. Friends noticed the difference, but didn't comment. They still smiled at social occasions, still took pictures together, still behaved like a functional couple. But those who looked more closely could perceive the weight between the lines. One Friday night, Gabriel prepared dinner. He'd bought her favorite wine, lit candles, and turned down the music. He tried, without saying anything, to remind them both of what had brought them together. Isabella arrived late. She said she was exhausted, went upstairs, changed her clothes, gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, and went to bed without dinner. He stood there, in front of the set table, his wine still unopened. He drank a glass alone. He didn't cry, he didn't complain. He simply stared into space and understood that sometimes love needs more than memories to survive. But he still resisted. On Sunday, he took her out to lunch. They tried to talk. They talked about the weather, about work, about the office renovation. But they didn't talk about themselves. Gabriel wanted to ask if there was still an us, but he was afraid of the answer. And she wanted to say that she missed the time when her heart beat faster for him, but she also didn't know how. They both walked a fine line between what they had been and what they no longer knew they could be. And so the days went by. Between trying and keeping quiet, between wanting and not knowing how. A dance disguised as routine, in which the two avoided stepping on each other's wounds. Each in their own way, they tried to hold on to what they had, even without knowing exactly how much remained. But life, silent and relentless, takes its toll. And what comes next begins precisely the night she returned from that dinner. And everything changed. Isabella began to change subtly, like someone who gradually distances themselves so that their absence seems natural. Gabriel noticed the automatic gestures, the shorter kisses, the laughter that, when it did appear, seemed no longer to come from him. It was as if she were always looking elsewhere, even though she was right beside him. Her messages stopped being spontaneous and became short, practical, almost functional responses. When he asked how her day had been, her answers came mechanically, with a rehearsed smile and a gaze that avoided his. And yet, he continued trying to maintain his presence, insisting on small gestures, perhaps out of fear of admitting that love, the one that made them breathe in sync, was no longer the same. She began spending more time away, justifying it with meetings that dragged on, dinners with coworkers, projects that required more dedication. Gabriel, even feeling the ground slipping beneath his feet, still believed her words. He preferred to believe. But instinct, silent and cruel, began to scream inside him. It wasn't a matter of proof, it was an absence that spoke too loudly. When she came home, she avoided his touch, and when he tried to talk, she always diverted the conversation, like someone fearing a confrontation they'd already lost inside. There were nights he pretended to be asleep, only to hear her silently fiddling with her things, removing her makeup with weary movements, texting with the glow of her phone reflected in a strange face, different from the one he used to admire. And on those nights, Gabriel felt his heart heavy with a pain he could no longer hide. Isabella, for her part, was experiencing a devastating internal conflict. He was trying to balance what remained of his marriage with an attraction that had grown unexpectedly. At first, it was just a close conversation with a coworker, someone who made her laugh when the days were too heavy. She didn't seek it, but she allowed it. She didn't desire it, but she didn't block it. And before she realized it, she had already crossed the line of intimacy. She began expecting messages from him, telling him secrets she once shared with Gabriel, seeking advice, compliments, affection. And one day, late at night, after another glass of wine at a bar, the kiss happened. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't resisted either. And it was then that she realized the size of the gulf between the woman she was with Gabriel and the one she now existed with someone else. But instead of backing away, she dove in. He continued living two lives, one public and unstable, the other clandestine and dangerous. She tried to act normally at home, but guilt no longer allowed her to look her husband in the eye without feeling her palms sweat. Gabriel began to feel the gaps between them widen irreversibly. Sundays, once reserved for coffee on the porch, became lonely. Their shared laughter disappeared, and even the silences seemed louder. He tried to organize a trip for two, a weekend to reconnect, but she claimed work commitments. Deep down, he knew better. One night, he found a box in her room containing an unopened gift, something he had bought her weeks before. It lay untouched, forgotten, a cruel reminder that gestures of love no longer touched her heart. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. But his soul, silently, was already saying goodbye. The following weeks were a rehearsed dance between his attempt to hold on to what remained and her hesitation to admit she'd crossed a line. Gabriel no longer slept well, spending his days with a consuming anguish, finding himself staring into space trying to understand when everything had slipped out of control. The once welcoming home was now a place where the echo of loneliness echoed even in the walls. He began to pay more attention to schedules, details, and the repeated excuses. One night, as she was getting ready for another work dinner, he watched silently, noticing a perfume she never wore at home, a different lipstick, a bolder dress. She smiled at him hurriedly and said she wouldn't be long, that it was just another work commitment. He didn't respond. He simply smiled back, an empty smile, and wished her good night. And in that silence, everything shattered inside him. She left. And he watched the door close, like someone observing an unannounced end, yet one that was felt in every detail. That night, he didn't try to pretend everything was okay. He drank a glass of wine, sat on the sofa, and stared into the void with the certainty he'd avoided until then. Memories came rushing back, the first kisses, the whispered promises between laughs, the conversations that lasted until dawn. But no memory could hold the weight of the absence that now resided between them. When the clock struck midnight, he went upstairs to his room. But he didn't sleep. He remained silent, just listening to the house, waiting for the sound of the key turning in the lock. She arrived at almost 1 a.m. She took off her shoes at the entrance, walked slowly, and went straight to the bathroom. Gabriel, still awake, heard every step. When she entered the room, he pretended to be asleep. But he couldn't help but notice the scent of a masculine perfume mingled with hers. And in that moment, he understood everything. He didn't need to see messages, he didn't need confessions. Her body bore invisible marks that only those who have loved deeply would recognize. He felt no anger, only a calm sadness, which hurt more because it didn't scream. The next morning, coffee was served in silence. She tried to make conversation, but he only smiled distantly. His gaze didn't accuse her. He simply no longer sought her out. That week, he left work early and stopped by home before her. He grabbed a small suitcase, organized a few belongings, and wrote a short note. There were no explanations, no accusations, no drama. Just a sentence written with the sobriety of someone who understood everything. He left the house key nearby. When she arrived from the next dinner, she found the heaviest silence that had ever inhabited that space. His suitcase was gone, and on the table, only the note and the key. She ran through the apartment as if something could be undone, but what was broken was invisible. It was an absence that could not be undone by regret. She tried calling. She texted. But he didn't answer. He didn't run away. He simply left with the dignity of someone who loved until the end. In the following days, she plunged into the chaos of feelings she had previously avoided. She reread the note so many times that she knew it by heart, but she never had the courage to throw it away. The house now seemed too big, too empty, and the silence she had used as a shield now suffocated her. She tried to move on with her life, tried to pretend she was still the same. But in every corner of the house, Gabriel was still there. Not physically, but in the gestures she repeated without realizing it, in the songs he left playing, in the coffee she made in the morning, in the pillow that seemed to still hold him. Time passed, but the feeling of loss intensified, because his absence revealed something she had ignored: he was the love of her life. And when she finally tried to get closer, it was too late. He didn't block her. He didn't mistreat her. But he was in a different emotional place. There was a serenity in his responses, an absence of hurt that, paradoxically, hurt even more. She began to understand what she had done. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the choice to destroy what they had, to gamble on a void, thinking it would be filled with something new. And when the void revealed itself for what it was, ephemeral, cold, fleeting, there was no turning back. But there was something else. Something she didn't know. Something he would also discover later. And something that would change the meaning of everything. A light rain fell on the sidewalk as Gabriel got out of the car and stopped in front of the brightly lit ballroom where Isabella's brother's wedding was taking place. Life, with its cruel irony, brought him back to the same core that had been his for years, now a changed man, more whole and at peace. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and shook hands with the woman who now accompanied him, a serene presence at his side, someone who had arrived unhurriedly and rebuilt in him what had once been shattered. She smiled, and in that smile was something he had never found in Isabella again: tranquility. They entered the ballroom together, without fanfare, simply with the firmness of someone who no longer owed anything to the past. Gabriel recognized faces, smiles, polite greetings. But it was as if he were visiting a place where he no longer belonged. And yet, he was there by choice. It was the last link. And somehow, he felt the need to close something that still breathed silently within him. Isabella was sitting at one of the tables near the altar. Alone. Her eyes searched the room for something, until they found it. And froze. She saw Gabriel enter with another woman at his side, and in a second, everything inside her fell apart. There was no scandal, no surprise. But the pain of seeing him smile lightly, of seeing him well, of seeing him with someone who now occupied the space that had once been his. Her throat went dry, and she looked away, trying to control the impact. This was real. He really was in another life. And there was no room for her there anymore. During the ceremony, their eyes met only once, briefly, without the need for words. But it was at the end of the night, when the lights in the hall were already dimming and the guests were saying their goodbyes, that she approached. She asked for a few minutes. He hesitated, but agreed. They went to a more private corner, where the music was muffled and the sounds of the party seemed distant. They stood face to face after months of silence. She seemed more fragile, but there was something different. There was no makeup to hide her fatigue, no pose to maintain pride. It was just her, stripped bare. She began in a low voice, almost a whisper, saying she didn't know where to begin. She said she hadn't called him to talk before because she didn't know what to say that would change anything. She'd spent weeks trying to understand when she destroyed everything. She blamed herself every day, but she still didn't know how to fix what she'd broken. Gabriel listened silently, without interrupting. Her eyes held no anger, just a safe distance he'd learned to maintain. Then she took a deep breath and said she needed to tell him something. Something he didn't know. Something that might not change anything, but that she needed to get out of her system. He fell silent once more, as if allowing it. Isabella then explained, her voice cracking with shame, that she had sought out the other man after the divorce. That the night Gabriel left, she tried to pursue something she thought was a possible future. And she pursued him. Her lover. The one for whom she had exchanged true love for an empty promise. And she said that, for days, she believed they could now try something serious, since he was free. She even imagined that perhaps it would be possible to rebuild with him what she had destroyed with Gabriel. But it was then that he rejected her. With cold contempt, he said that all of this only made sense while she was married. That his interest lay in the risk, the forbidden. He said, with a dry laugh, that she was just a wish fulfilled. A fantasy. Nothing more. And that now, free, she was too ordinary. Gabriel listened with his eyes fixed on her, as if he already knew the truth but needed to hear it from the source to bury any illusions once and for all. She wept as she spoke, without asking for pity, without defending herself. She said she begged, that she tried to understand, that she sought answers and found only contempt. And she confessed that she spent nights lying on the floor of her own room, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand when she had become so disposable. Gabriel said nothing. His chest was firm, but not cold. There was compassion in her eyes, but no longer love. She continued, saying she saw him happy that day, that she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen with her. A peace she couldn't bring. That seeing him with another woman, she understood he had healed, while she still carried the shards of everything she'd caused. She said she didn't want to get back together, that she didn't expect immediate forgiveness. But she needed him to know. Because the silence was killing her. Because she still loved him. Because she had destroyed her own future with her own hands and now lived in an empty present, made only of memories and regrets. It was then that Gabriel took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and, with the same calm with which he'd left, said he already knew. Not with proof, but with the kind of intuition only those who love know. He said he didn't hate her. That he never would. But that his absence now was the only answer he could offer. He said that what he felt for her had died the night she returned and didn't kiss him. That there, in that gesture, everything was revealed. And that the greatest pain wasn't the betrayal, but realizing she hadn't had the courage to be honest with him, even when everything was falling apart. She cried, without hiding it, without pride. She said she deserved it all. That now she understood what she'd lost. And he simply replied, in a low voice, that she hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost someone who loved her even in the days when she no longer loved him. Someone who would have stayed, if he'd been called truthfully. She said she forgave. But that forgiveness didn't mean return. That she'd learned, the hard way, that love doesn't survive where loyalty is forgotten. At that moment, the room in the back was already emptying. And they sat in silence for a few seconds. She thanked him for listening. And, with eyes still teary, she wished him to be happy with who he was now. Gabriel nodded. He said he was learning to be. And that, for the first time in a long time, he felt he was where he was supposed to be. She turned, walked to the door, and didn't look back. He stood there for a few moments, taking it all in. The past was over. The wound had healed. And the truth, finally revealed, no longer hurt him. But he knew that, for her, that conversation would be eternal. Because some mistakes don't scream in the moment. They echo forever. Gabriel left the salon, and the cool dawn breeze touched his face with the gentleness of someone closing a cycle. The car was parked a few meters away, but he took his time. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, still wet from the persistent drizzle, as if each step sealed a necessary final point. His new companion waited inside the vehicle, respecting the space he had requested with a simple glance before stepping aside to speak to Isabella. There was a silent wisdom between them, built on patience and genuine affection. As he approached, she simply extended her hand and intertwined her fingers with his. She didn't ask anything. And it was precisely this lack of haste, of demands, of the need for explanations that made him realize, even more clearly, how right he was. On the drive home, Gabriel stared out the window, watching the city pass by like a distant reflection of the life he was leaving behind. Not a word was spoken until they reached the apartment building. There, they went upstairs together, and he hugged her as if offering an unspoken thank you. They slept peacefully that night, without noise, without ghosts, without shadows. However, in the days that followed, Gabriel still found himself immersed in deep thought, not out of doubt, but because some stories, even after they're over, still resonate as lessons. He knew he had closed the most painful chapter of his life, but he also knew that something had changed forever within him. Meanwhile, Isabella faced a completely different scenario. The conversation with Gabriel, though liberating in certain ways, had stripped her of all illusions. For the first time, she could no longer resort to the excuse of time, nor to the fantasies she had created to justify her own choices. She was alone, and this time for good. Her lover had disappeared months ago, and even though she still tried to maintain a certain social appearance, inside she was slowly crumbling. Her friends gradually drifted away, not out of judgment, but because she was no longer present. She was always distant, distracted, empty. She began spending more time at home, revisiting old photos, rereading saved messages, watching short videos of trips she'd taken with Gabriel. But none of this brought comfort. It was a process of emotional torture to which she willingly subjected herself, perhaps as a form of self-punishment. One day, she decided to walk to the park where they used to go on Sundays. She sat on the same bench, now weathered with age, and watched couples passing by, families with children, laughter echoing. And there, in that ordinary setting, she felt the exact weight of the choice she'd made. She had traded stable, genuine love for an illusion. For a shallow emotion that, like all shallow emotions, quickly fades. Unsure of what to do with so much regret, she sought out a therapist. She wasn't looking for a fresh start with Gabriel, as she already understood that path was closed forever. But she needed, somehow, to find her bearings. She needed to understand why she acted as she did, why she hurt the one she loved most, why she didn't have the courage to be honest when there was still time. In the sessions, she relived everything: the wedding, the small, ignored signs, the euphoria of the forbidden, the coldness of abandonment, and, above all, the exact moment she lost what mattered most. She cried a lot. But she cried inside, her soul emptied of all that had once held warmth. Gabriel, on the other hand, continued his life with ease and self-respect. With his new partner, he discovered ways of loving that didn't require sacrificing identity or hurtful concessions. The relationship grew slowly, unhurriedly, without comparisons. There was transparency in every gesture, sincerity in every conversation, and, most importantly, there was peace. They began to frequent new places, created new habits, and, over time, shared plans. One night, during a simple dinner at home, he looked at her and said, in a firm voice, that he had learned that true love doesn't hurt, doesn't impose, doesn't confuse. She simply smiled, as if she understands with her soul. A few weeks later, Gabriel received a short message from Isabella. She said she wanted to see him one last time, in a public place, just to say thank you. He thought for a few minutes before replying. He decided to accept. They met at a discreet cafe on an ordinary afternoon. She arrived first, her hair tied back and her eyes tired, but there was a different look in her eyes, no longer one of supplication, but of acceptance. When he arrived, she stood, offered him a brief hug, and they sat across from each other like two acquaintances who share a history that cannot be erased, but also does not need to be rewritten. She said she didn't expect answers, nor gestures of compassion. She simply wanted to thank him. For the way he loved her. For the way he left. For the silence that taught her more than any fight. And, most of all, for his forgiveness. She said that his gesture, in that room, months ago, saved her from completely sinking into despair. She said that, since then, she'd been trying to rebuild not what they'd lost, but what was left of herself. And that, even in pain, she was learning. Gabriel listened, his eyes steady and his heart calm. When she finished, he said that all of it, despite the pain, had made him grow. That the fall was profound, but that rebuilding had brought him to where he needed to be. She smiled, but her eyes still held a longing. She said she now understood that losing Gabriel was like losing a part of herself that she might never get back. And that she wouldn't look for anyone else to fill that space, knowing the emptiness was part of the price. He simply nodded. They paid the bill and stood. On the way out, she extended her hand, and he shook it. A firm, honest grip, like someone closing the last chapter with dignity. There was no kiss, no promises, no explicit longing. Just two paths that finally accepted they would no longer cross. That night, Gabriel returned home, found his companion reading on the sofa, and sat down beside her. He looked at her for a long time and said, in a tone unpretentious of drama, "Today I buried my past once and for all." She closed the book and rested her head on his shoulder, as if she understood without needing to ask. Outside, the city continued to throb, but inside, there was silence, no longer the silence of absence, but of peace. And in that silence, everything began anew. Isabella, for her part, also returned home. Alone. But for the first time in a long time, he opened the windows, let the air in, turned on some light music, and made coffee. He knew the emptiness would still be there in the morning. But he also knew that now, at least, he was beginning to face it without masks. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step in not making the same mistake again. Because some loves are never repeated. And there are losses that aren't punishments, they're harsh lessons in how love, when mistreated, never returns. Time doesn't rush when healing is needed, and that was exactly what was imposed on Gabriel and Isabella after that last encounter. The past, once so present and inflamed, now breathed like a static memory, painful but stable, archived in the exact place where it belonged. There were no more pending issues between them. But the existence of forgiveness doesn't erase the traces of what had been experienced. She continued on her way with the weight of her conscience, not as punishment, but as lucidity. And he, with the lightness of someone who survived emotional ruin and managed to rebuild a life that didn't need to erase what existed, but that no longer held on to what was useless. This maturity, silent and achieved through tears no one saw, transformed Gabriel into a different man. He now walked with a different rhythm, with more presence, with more discernment. His words were more direct, his affections more chosen, his surrender more refined. He didn't love less, on the contrary, he now loved better, with more wholeness and less fantasy. He didn't need to prove anything, nor beg for reciprocity. And that's why his new relationship blossomed so steadily. The woman who now shared his days with him was neither a replacement nor a repair. She was the consequence of a cycle ended with dignity. They knew each other in their pain, respected each other's space, understood that each bore scars, but that love isn't about erasing them, but about embracing them. Their moments together had more presence and less effort, more truth and less fear. With her, Gabriel found a kind of tranquil happiness, without excess, without unrealistic expectations. He learned to value the small rituals, the pauses, the conversations at dusk, the silent complicity in everyday gestures. With her, he no longer needed to be the man who held everything together. Now there was balance. And in this new dynamic, he rediscovered what it was like to feel loved completely, without having to beg for space to exist. Meanwhile, Isabella, albeit silently, had to continue living in the same space she once shared with Gabriel. The apartment hadn't changed much, but the weight of the walls now seemed heavier. Each room was a reminder of what had been lost. And, little by little, she realized that it wasn't the end of the relationship that hurt most, but rather the recognition of the woman she had become in the process. It was hard to face the reflection of someone who had hurt their own love through immaturity, who hid behind momentary desires to avoid important conversations. She now saw clearly that, deep down, Gabriel had always been available to listen to her, to rebuild with her, to start over, but she was the one who closed the doors before even trying. It wasn't regret for losing, it was grief for not having fought. In therapy, she began to face other truths. The betrayal, though unforgivable, wasn't born from a single gesture. It was built on small omissions, silences, pride disguised as autonomy, and a profound inability to be vulnerable. She never had the courage to say she felt lost, that she needed help, that she didn't know how to deal with the routine or the weight of her own ambitions. She feigned self-sufficiency and confused freedom with indifference. When her lover appeared, he offered the mirror she longed to see, desire, novelty, validation. But all of that was a reflection of an inner absence she refused to face. Only after everything was gone did she realize that true value lies in those who stay even when things are difficult, in those who face the other's discomfort with patience, in those who continue to choose the same heart even when the days are difficult. And Gabriel was that person. But it was too late. Over time, she began to redirect her choices. She reduced her workload, sought new circles, distanced herself from everything that tied her to her old self. She began to indulge in productive silences, long walks alone, coffees that lasted longer than necessary. Social media was abandoned for a long time. She understood that she needed to relearn how to listen to herself. It wasn't about seeking another love. It was about becoming a better person before considering sharing her life again. Sometimes, the memory of Gabriel would surface strongly, in songs, in places, in conversations with acquaintances. But instead of desperate sadness, it now emerged with serene melancholy. She knew he was happy. And that hurt. But it was a fair pain. Gabriel, for his part, even far from all this, felt, in very deep layers, the difference between moving on and moving on in peace. And now, finally, he was in both. He had said goodbye not only to Isabella, but also to the guilt, the anxiety, the need to understand everything. He accepted that some things will never be fully explained and that forgiveness doesn't erase mistakes, but dissolves the prison they create. Casual reunions with old friends were gradually happening. Some still insisted on asking if he would go back, if there was still room for reconnection. Gabriel smiled gently and replied firmly, "Some stories need to end so we can finally learn who we are." And that, more than an answer, was a lesson. The moral dilemma, which had previously seemed a burden, to forgive or not, to follow or wait, to confront or remain silent, had now transformed into understanding. Gabriel no longer needed to know the why of everything. He understood that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll be able to love in the same way. That good intentions don't prevent profound mistakes. That even the best hearts can cause wounds. And that, in the end, each person is responsible for their own path, for the choices they make, for the doors they open and close. He chose not to hold a grudge because he knew that grudges are a prison in which the other person isn't always present, you're the one trapped. One quiet night, during a conversation with his partner, she asked if he still thought about Isabella. The question wasn't prompted by jealousy, but by honest curiosity. Gabriel thought for a few seconds and replied that he did, but not as before. That now he thought of it as if he remembered a place where he'd lived for a long time, a place that had had good times, but that was no longer home. He said he still respected the history, that he would never erase it, but that he no longer missed her. Only gratitude for having survived and learned. This answer resonated with him for the next few days. Not because he doubted what he said, but because it was the first time he had named what he felt so clearly. And it was then that he realized, he was, indeed, ready. Ready for a new life, not as an escape from the past, but as a natural consequence of someone who had lived intensely, suffered deeply, and chosen not to become bitter. Life now was not an attempt to forget, but a daily commitment to what made sense. Isabella, for her part, continued her journey with dignity. She didn't seek rapprochement, didn't write letters, didn't prowl the places he might be. She respected his space with the same maturity with which she now cared for her own. Sometimes, she would meet acquaintances who would comment on Gabriel, on the new woman beside him, on the tranquility visible on his face. She simply smiled. And within that smile was pain, but also acceptance. She knew she had lost something precious. But she no longer ran from it. She accepted, with the courage she once lacked, that she was the one who broke it. And she understood, with humility, that love isn't just about feeling, it's, above all, about protecting. Their lives went on. And, little by little, their days were filled with new routines, new affections, new versions of themselves. But even separated, even in different worlds, each carried with them the memory of that story that, however painful, was decisive in shaping them into who they became. They no longer belonged to each other. But, somehow, they would always recognize each other, not as a possible reunion, but as a mirror of what they were, what they chose, and what they learned. Because the truth is that sometimes the person we love most is also the one who teaches us the most about love, at the exact moment they lose us. Autumn arrived with lighter winds and golden afternoons, as if the season reflected Gabriel's new emotional state. There was, in the slowly falling leaves, a metaphor for everything he had experienced, the natural detachment from what had served its purpose. He now observed the world with a less harsh and more attentive gaze, noticing the details that had previously gone unnoticed when his mind was trapped in what had been. It was no longer a matter of oblivion, but of transition. The old pain no longer burned, but still resided in the form of wisdom, an emotional scar that didn't limit him, but guided him. His current relationship continued with the lightness he had always desired, but which he only understood was possible when he learned to respect his own limits. There was love, there was truth, and, above all, there was reciprocity. But even with all this, one final emotional movement still needed to happen. Not with Isabella, but within himself. He began to write. Nothing planned, nothing with literary intent. They were letters that wouldn't be sent, but which served as an internal mirror. He wrote to the version of himself that endured everything in silence, to the man he loved dearly, who left with dignity, who forgave without needing to hear an explicit request. In one letter, he wrote about how it felt to sleep alone in the first weeks after the separation, about the fear of never trusting again, and about the surprise of having found someone who loved him so openly. In another, he spoke about Isabella with brutal honesty, admitting that, despite everything, she was a woman who marked his life, not because of the mistake, but because of everything they had experienced before. As he wrote, he discovered unexplored inner spaces, remnants of pain barely named, but also realized how much he had grown throughout the process. Each word on paper freed him a little more from the shadow of what he had been through. Isabella, for her part, had started a therapeutic writing course recommended by her therapist. She felt the need to vent, but also to organize her feelings, to build something from her inner chaos. The course took place on Saturday mornings, in a small space with large windows and the smell of fresh coffee. There, surrounded by strangers who also carried hidden wounds, she began to understand that she wasn't alone in dealing with deep regrets, that the pain of losing a great love by choice was more common than she imagined. She wrote about what she kept quiet for years, about the days she feigned happiness, about the night she didn't kiss Gabriel when she got home and everything began to fall apart. Between the lines, she began to realize that her betrayal wasn't an isolated act, but the culmination of a series of emotional neglects. And the more she wrote, the more her soul reorganized. One day, the two ended up meeting again. It wasn't planned. It was a charity event at a small bookstore downtown, something casual they both were interested in, but they didn't know they would be sharing the same space that late afternoon. Gabriel arrived accompanied, while Isabella was alone, with a book in her hands and a serene expression. Upon seeing each other, they exchanged a discreet nod. No embarrassment. Just a respectful acknowledgement that time had done its work. Later, they passed each other in the narrow aisle between two bookshelves. She smiled first, and he responded kindly. She said she was fine, her tone sincere and didn't require confirmation. He mentioned he'd recently read an article that reminded her of it, about silent decisions that change everything. She said she knew the text and thought about it sometimes. They sat in silence for a few seconds, until she asked if he was happy. The question wasn't invasive, nor was it filled with expectation. It was genuine. He replied that he was, and the gleam in his eyes confirmed it. He asked if she was happy too. She took a deep breath, looked at the ground for a moment, and said she was learning. And that maybe that was a kind of happiness, too. Before they said goodbye, she took a small envelope from her purse and handed it to him. She simply said it wasn't an attempt to get back together, but something she needed to share, and that she would only read it if she wanted to. He kept it there and then, unopened, respectfully. They parted with a brief hug, the kind that acknowledges the past but doesn't desire the future. That night, at home, after dinner, while his partner was taking a shower, Gabriel opened the envelope. It was a letter. Handwritten, with firm handwriting. In it, Isabella spoke of the exact day she realized she had lost him forever, and how that day wasn't when he left home, but when she saw his look at her brother's wedding. She said that look didn't carry hatred or hurt, but something far worse for those who love, indifference. She said that, from that moment on, she stopped fighting the past and began to struggle to understand her own mistake. She spoke of everything with the bluntness of someone seeking closure, not comfort. Reading that letter didn't generate anger or sadness in Gabriel. Only a strange feeling that, somehow, she still needed him to witness her own repentance. And when he finished reading, he understood something important. There was love in her words, but it was a belated love, like flowers that bloom out of season, beautiful, but doomed to die without purpose. He folded the letter carefully and put it in a box with other memories he didn't need to access often, but didn't want to erase. He knew that gesture was symbolic, not a fresh start, but a definitive ending. They no longer needed to see each other, or talk, or update each other on their lives. Each now had their own storyline. And that was enough. Weeks later, Gabriel received an invitation to a professional event in another city. It would be a short but important trip. He decided to bring his partner. During the 3 days, they took advantage not only of the work, but also of the new air, trying different cafes, and walking unfamiliar streets hand in hand. On the last day, as they watched the sunset on a wooden deck by a lake, she asked him what he had learned most from everything he had experienced. He took a while to answer, watching the golden reflection of the light on the water. And then he said, calmly, that he had learned that love requires courage, but that loyalty demands even more. That a relationship can survive bad days, financial crises, family problems, but never survives a lack of truth. He said that love is, above all, caring for the other as one would care for oneself. And that, when that is lost, everything falls apart. She didn't respond with words. She just hugged him. And there, in the middle of a place where no one knew them, Gabriel felt his life had finally found a center. There was no more weight, no unfinished business, no unresolved issues. There was, at last, a clear path before him. Isabella, somewhere on the other side of the city, was walking alone when something inside her told her that she finally no longer expected anything in return. That the love she once had for Gabriel was now a love that needed to be released, not so that it would disappear, but so that it would no longer imprison her. And in that silent act of release, she realized that she could, one day, love again, in a more just, more present, more honest way. Their story wasn't a tragedy, nor a romance of reconciliation. It was, above all, a true story. About choices, losses, and rebuilding. About the pain of betrayal and the pain of being betrayed. About the strength of those who leave and the courage of those who stay. About endings that don't require an audience, but that change everything within those who experience them. And, above all, about the dignity of accepting that not every love that existed was meant to last, but all have the power to teach. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most beautiful part of what life has to offer. Winter arrived, bringing with it a kind of silence that no longer caused discomfort, but rather maturity. The streets took on new colors, the seasons advanced, and with them, life moved in a direction that no longer carried haste, only purpose. Gabriel woke every day with an inner tranquility that came not only from the love he received, but from the peace he had built within himself after facing what, for a long time, he thought he would never overcome. He had understood that a man's true strength lies not in resisting suffering, but in not allowing it to define who he becomes later. The betrayal that broke him, the silent abandonment, the absence disguised as routine, all of that was now part of a closed chapter, one that didn't need to be forgotten, but that should never be relived. By his side, the woman he now shared his days with became more than a new love. She became proof that when you choose to heal rather than seek revenge, destiny takes care of placing in your path what truly aligns with your truth. The complicity between them no longer required grand gestures. It was felt in the way they looked at each other as they crossed the street, in the respect with which they listened to each other unhurriedly, in the way they celebrated the small victories of everyday life. One night, sitting on the sofa after a simple dinner, she took his hand, looked into his eyes, and told him she loved him with the certainty of someone unafraid to be transparent. Gabriel, with a discreet smile, responded without hesitation. It was love. It was different. And, above all, it was whole. There was no longer a trace of the man who had once slept next to someone who avoided touch, who averted glances, who lived between doubt and resignation. That man was in the past, with the woman who, out of weakness or disorientation, let him slip through her fingers as if he were something disposable. Isabella, on the other hand, lived a reality that mixed maturity with loneliness. She had managed to rebuild a solid career, new projects kept her busy, and little by little she was rediscovering her own identity. But as much as the days progressed with some stability, there was a void that not even time could fill. The void of knowing that had caused her own downfall. Sometimes, walking the streets or seeing couples chatting in cafes, she felt a longing that wasn't just for Gabriel, but for the woman she was when she was by his side. A version of herself that hadn't yet been destroyed by thoughtless choices and fears she hadn't had the courage to express. Her relationship with the past was no longer one of desperate regret, but of painful realizations. One random Sunday, she decided to visit the park where she had been with him so many times. She sat on the same bench, watched the people passing by, and understood that love doesn't disappear when it ends, it transforms into a lesson, and that the pain that remains is the one that truly teaches. One afternoon, leaving a meeting, she ran into an old friend who was still in touch with Gabriel. The woman greeted her naturally, they exchanged a few words, and, at the end, she mentioned how happy and fulfilled he was, and that he had recently held a small, private engagement ceremony with few guests, as he had always preferred. Isabella listened with a restrained smile. It wasn't envy, nor jealousy. It was simply the final confirmation that she was no longer part of anything involving him. She returned home that night with a strange urge to write, but instead of letters, she wrote to herself. He wrote everything he had never had the courage to admit out loud. That he had been immature. That he had preferred fantasy to depth. That he had confused freedom with absence. And that now, even having regained some balance, he knew that certain absences would never be filled again. Months passed, and their lives took completely different paths. Gabriel decided to move to another city. He wanted a new setting, a place where he could begin a new phase without any direct connection to what he'd experienced. The change was easy. The new home was simple but full of meaning. His partner helped him transform each space into something that represented them. They put together a bookshelf, chose plants, and hung pictures with phrases that represented their new era. And one sunny afternoon, Gabriel sat on the porch, looked around, and was absolutely certain that it had all been worth it, including the pain. Isabella also changed. Not her city, but her perspective. She began giving lectures on human relationships, on how thoughtless decisions can affect not only others but also destroy parts of us that never return. She spoke with authority. She knew her words were about herself, even if she never revealed the details. It was her way of transforming her experience into something useful. With each lecture, she felt a strange relief, as if with each sentence uttered, a part of the weight was being lifted onto the stage. At night, she walked home alone, but now she no longer cried. She read, wrote, reflected. She learned to live with the loss, but she also learned to rebuild herself without illusions. Time, inevitably, continued to pass. Gabriel got married. The ceremony was intimate, charged with meaning. One of his vows read, "After so much pain, what I wanted most was peace. And I found you." Isabella, who hadn't heard about the ceremony, dreamed of him that same night. In the dream, he smiled at her, but didn't come near. He simply waved from afar, with a serene gaze. Upon waking, she felt that dreamlike gesture seal everything that remained. She cried. But for the first time, it wasn't pain. It was liberation. This story ends with two completely different paths. A man who lost everything and rebuilt with dignity. A woman who destroyed everything and learned to live with its absence. Neither of them forgot what they experienced. Neither of them emerged intact. But they both moved on. And that's what makes this story real. Because, in life, there isn't always reconciliation. But there is learning. There is transformation. There are consequences. If you've made it this far, now I want to hear from you. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part touched you most? Which character made you reflect? Your opinion is crucial and will help us create even more stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Here, each story is crafted with soul, and always with a powerful lesson behind it. This narrative shows us, with brutal honesty, how betrayal corrodes not only the bond between two people, but the very emotional foundation of the betrayer. Because betrayal isn't just about seeking outside what's missing within. It's also about breaking with everything that was carefully built. It's abandoning those who believed in you. It's erasing a story in exchange for a moment. And when true love is erased, what's left isn't freedom, it's regret. Remember, this channel will never support any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to truth, real feelings, and the defense of healthy relationships. Because love, when it's true, doesn't betray itself. It cares for itself. It protects itself. It chooses itself, every day. Until the next story.